Setting the background, I want to look a little bit at history, and we're going to go back in our time machine to 1935. And in 1935, the Nazis were in power. They were new to power, and they started passing laws. Some of these laws were called the Nuremberg Laws. In the Nuremberg Laws, Jews were no longer considered citizens, but were now subjects. Cities were free to pass their own stricter versions of the laws. One of them was you could not marry non-Jews. Now, this is the actual chart. It's in German. We can't read it. But translated to English, it is a marriage chart of what marriages are allowed and what marriages will be prohibited. Marriage between a Jew and someone of German blood was strictly prohibited. But what if you were partially Jewish and partially German? But what if you weren't fully German, but you kind of had some German blood in you? Say you were Austrian or maybe a little bit into Polish. Where does the marriage laws lie? So the Germans created this chart. And in this chart, you're able to parse down who Jews can and cannot marry. Jews were forbidden to serve in public office. In some cities, they couldn't be journalists, farmers, teachers. They could not work in finance, couldn't be lawyers, couldn't be doctors. Many of them lost their whole business. And this started in 1935, and as we know, it got worse and worse. Here's just a picture of someone measuring physical characteristics of a person to see if, in their opinion, that person had the physical characteristics of a Jewish nose. We know that was Hitler's warm-up now, that they got more and more strict, and as time went on, folks were not just being moved into different parts of cities, into the Jewish ghettos. They were being moved out of town, and they weren't being moved out of town to work camps, but they were being moved out of town to death camps. This is a picture from the United States Holocaust Museum of the famous Auschwitz death camp in Poland, taken at an unknown time, but believed to be a few years after the war. When, if you remember, when Germany fell, the United States and its allies are coming in from the west, and the Soviet Union is coming in from the east. Poland is east of Germany. And so the Soviet Union took over this part, so we don't have a lot of immediate pictures of Auschwitz, but it's definitely one of the more famous death camps because so many people perished there. Here's one picture we do have of Hungarian Jews. You can recognize Auschwitz in the upper left, being unloaded at the camp. Now this is on the inside. If we go back and you look at where on the left side there is a window, a very large one, looks like an overhang. If you look over here, it's reversed. And so now we're on the inside. This train is now inside the camp. People have unloaded. And as we know, they're being unloaded to perish there. They didn't know that. They brought their suitcases. They brought all kinds of stuff. There's a pile of suitcases that was just left there that people just abandoned. And in the lower right is a particularly interesting picture. Those are sacks of women's hair that are being shipped back to Germany. Those are people who have died and been killed, and now the Nazis are saving their hair and they're sending it back. I want to describe how German engineer Hermann Grabe testified to it when he was testifying about some of his experiences at a different camp. And this comes from Mark Lanier's Good Lesson. German engineer Hermann Grabe says, the people who had got off the trucks, so this was a camp where they're bringing in trucks, men, women, and children of all ages, had to undress upon the order of an SS man who carried a riding or a dog whip. They had put down their clothes in fixed places, sorted according to shoes, top clothing, and underclothing. I saw a heap of shoes, about 800 to 1,000 pairs. Without screaming or weeping, these people undressed. They stood around in family groups, kissed each other, said farewells, and waited for a sign from another SS man who stood near a pit. An old woman with snow-white hair was holding a 1-year-old child in her arms and singing to it and tickling it. The child was cooing with delight. The parents looked on with tears in their eyes. The father was holding the hand of a boy about 10 years old and speaking to him softly. The boy was fighting tears. The father pointed to the sky, stroked his head, and seemed to explain something to him. At that moment, the SS man in the pit shouted something to his comrade. The latter counted off about 20 people and instructed them to go behind the earth mound. I remember a girl, slim with black hair, who, as she passed close to me, pointed to herself and said, 23 years old. I walked around the mound and found myself confronted by a tremendous grave. People were closely wedged together and lying on top of each other so that only their heads were visible. Some of the people were still moving. I looked for the man who did the shooting. He was an SS man who sat at the edge of the narrow end of the pit, his feet dangling into the pit. He had a Tommy gun on his knees and was smoking a cigarette. Pretty disturbing scene. Now, that happened at a different camp, and as we know, so that one they used bullets. As we know from history, bullets were inefficient, and the Nazis, being an efficient people, discovered it was more efficient to terminate massive amounts of people using a gas chamber. We don't have to waste the ammunition. It's not as messy. We just bring them in, gas them, bring them out. This is horrific, and we know it's horrific. We'd like to write it off as a one-off and say that was those people of that society. Humans don't do that to each other anymore, but we know that's not the case. In fact, historians can't even agree on who the deadliest tyrant of the 20th century was. If you go by sheer number of deaths, Mao killed 40 million. However, a lot of those were from famine and economic policies by which people perished, and not all of them were human killing human straight up. So, if you want to take out famine, then we go with Hitler with 34 million deaths. However, many of those were by war, where people signed up and agreed to shoot and kill each other. So, if you just want to take out war and just take out someone killing an unarmed person, then we got to go with Stalin with 20 million deaths. We can't even agree on who the deadliest tyrant of the 1900s was, and that's just the 1900s. We can go back and back and back, and some people say it's Genghis Khan. We would like to write it off as a one-off, but we have these examples that many folks, without question, will say that was wrong. So we start with the Nuremberg laws that started the persecution. We ended with the Nuremberg trials, where many of them were sentenced to hang, some of these Nazi criminals were sentenced to die in prison. But we tried them, and we tried them for their crimes. We know that what they did was wrong, but why was it wrong? That's what today's about. Why is what they did wrong? I think we can all agree that it's wrong, but why? The reason that we start with this example, such an extreme, horrific example, is because very, very, very few people will argue with you that what the Nazis did was wrong. Most folks will just admit that. I haven't found a person that said the Holocaust was a great thing. It's a bad thing. So we start there with common ground. You're talking with the atheist. That's common ground. We both agree that was wrong. We know why it was wrong, but why does the atheist say it's wrong? That's where we're going today. There's a moral law out there by which we judge actions, even if a whole society, such as the Nazis, says that that action was proper. There is a law that exists outside of society that we can use to judge that society and say, no, it doesn't matter if you all agree that something's right. That's still wrong. That's the moral law that we're headed to. A bit more background, though. How did some of these people come to believe that what they did was a good thing? Let's go to Darwin. In 1859, Charles Darwin wrote On the Origin of the Species. And if you read closely, the title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, when I learned about Darwin originally, that second part of the title was left off. But the book is about the preservation of favored races and the struggle for life, and he goes in, and we're familiar with his theories. Herbert Spencer, who came later in 1864, actually coined the phrase survival of the fittest. So that doesn't come from Darwin. It's the same concept, but it was Herbert Spencer that says survival of the fittest. The strong survive, the strong propagate, they pass their genes on to the next generation, and thus the race improves, the human race as a whole is improving, and the strongest are passing on their genes. That was the theory. I want to point to you what Darwin wrote, though, in his book, Descent of Man. He says, and I quote, "The Western nations of Europe now so immeasurably surpass their former savage progenitors that they stand at the summit of civilization. The civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races through the world." Now, the era that he lived in was all too willing to accept this, because what's going on in the 1860s? Colonization. The Western European nations and Americans are out colonizing the world and creating colonies, and this philosophy fit very neatly with that concept. An Australian newspaper, for example, argued that the inexorable law of natural selection justifies exterminating the inferior Australian and Maori races, and the world will be better for it. Colonists across Africa took up this charge in trying to subjugate many of the African peoples under certain banners. Many of you have been over to Ghana and have seen different, and been over to other nations in Africa and seen, well, this is where the Dutch were, this is where the French were, this is where the English were, this is why we speak these languages. But the philosophy behind a lot of that is what's disturbing. It was Christian missionaries in both instances, and we'll find this comforting as Christians. In both instances, in Africa and in the Australian, we have concrete evidence of Christian missionaries coming in to help the people who are being subjugated and coming in to render aid and render human help, medical aid to those people who are being either exterminated or argued to wipe out. Very comforting to know that we appeal to our moral law to go protect those people. Then it came to a head with German intellectual Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche rejected any sort of moral law. He's the one who coined the phrase, "God is dead." There's a book out by that name. I think Richard Dawkins wrote it, but it comes from Nietzsche. God is dead. There is no moral law. And he ridiculed philosophers who thought there was one. He said it's the consequence of the action that should be the judge of the action. We need to look at what kind of consequence that action produces before we say whether that action was right or wrong. We have to look at the consequence. He is the one who came up with the idea of the Übermensch, the Superman. He said that, okay, so this natural selection, we've evolved from these apes, right? Just as we're embarrassed of the apes, the humble ape, we look at the ape going around, dragging his knuckles, to think we came from that, and look how superior and intelligent we are. Well, if we've naturally selected our way up from an ape, at some point in the future, there's going to be a race of supermen who are just as embarrassed of us because they're so far beyond what we are. We're going to look like the ape to them. There's going to be this Superman, and it's inevitable that it happens. The longer time goes on, the closer we're going to get to that. It's inevitable. There's going to be a race of supermen. Now, think back 2 weeks ago to evidence for creation. If the universe was eternal, wouldn't that have already happened? If the universe had existed since infinity, wouldn't this evolutionary process already have taken place if there's an infinite number of days in the past? So not that Nietzsche is even thinking about creation of the universe, but now that we kind of have our thinking hats on and we've gone there, you're able to see these things as evidence for a beginning. Even using Nietzsche's own arguments, we're not there yet, thus the universe must have began at a certain point in time. Guess who loved Nietzsche? That guy. That guy loved Nietzsche's philosophy. When he was 11 years old, when Hitler was 11 years old, Nietzsche died. But Hitler gobbled up his works, really just engrossed by this idea of the Superman and creating this super people. And if you know much about history, and if you've studied the rise of the Nazi Party, sure, their actions are not forgivable. But you see how that happened with World War I ending and the horrible restrictions placed upon the German nation and the German people. They were hungry for something to be proud of. And here was someone who came along and told them they don't need to hang their heads anymore. You are a strong people. We are a good people. We don't need to hang our heads. In fact, we're not just a strong and a good people, we're the strongest people, and we're the best people. And that was music to the ears of a beat-down nation. So a whole semester could be held on the rise of the Nazi Empire. And I took one at A&M. It was a wonderful class. And we had a Holocaust survivor come visit, but we learned how the Nazis came to power. And included in this is how good people in that community allowed that to happen. Very educational for today, and how good people today allow certain things to happen, like us, in our culture. However, Hitler was just carrying out what Nietzsche said to do. He was purifying the human race, in his mind, from the dregs. If we're going to end up being the Superman anyway, let's just make it happen now. These races are inferior to my German race. Thus, let's start getting rid of them. And that was the idea. Now, he didn't rise to power using that as his party platform. In fact, that concept was held back quite a bit from the people, but it came out. We're going to create the super race, the Übermensch, the Superman. We're going to create that right now. And let's get rid of the dregs. So you can get mad at Hitler, and you can say he's wrong. However, if you're going to define what is good by that which is good for society, you cannot get mad at Hitler for what he did, because that society determined that was a good thing. So who decides what's right and wrong? Do we let our elected officials tell us what is right and wrong? Do we let the individual tell us what's right and wrong? Do we say, you know what? You decide for yourself what's right and wrong, and I'll decide for myself. Can we function like that? What about the elite of society? I think there are people who are all too happy to tell me what's right and wrong for my life and my faith. I'm thinking, what about maybe the media? Maybe they kind of know more. You know, I get the sense the way a lot of reporting is done, they're telling me the way I need to think. Maybe they, since they're telling me what I need to think anyway, they should decide what's right and wrong. What about just the majority? Let's take a vote and we'll decide what's right and wrong? Well, we as Christians don't believe that. We believe that a moral law exists, regardless of what we like one day and what we like the next day, that determines what's right and wrong. We believe humans are made in the image of God, and every human life has value for that reason, because we are image bearers of God. We call it the moral law. Others call it conscience. Some may call it just being good. But whatever you call it, it's written on our hearts. And our scripture tells us that the moral law is written on our hearts. C.S. Lewis says this. He says, think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle, or where a man could feel proud of double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. You might as well just try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 made 5. Men have differed as regards to what people ought to be unselfish to, whether it was your own family, your fellow countrymen, or everyone. But they have always agreed that you ought not to put yourself first. Selfishness has never been admired. Men have differed to whether you should have 1 wife or 4, but they have always agreed that you must not have simply any woman you liked. So most people know that helping is the right thing to do. Running away in battle is a wrong thing to do. There's no country, no people group has ever existed on the face of the planet where cowardice was rewarded with a medal. There are things that are good and things that are bad, things even instinctual that come to us that we have to fight. So is it instinct that tells us what's right? Because in battle, I may want to run away. That may be my instinct, is to run away. But there's something that exists outside me that says, I can't do that, I shouldn't do that. What is that? And that's common to all people groups, Christians and non-Christians. You know, on the entire face of the planet, running away in battle has never been admired. What is it that tells me I shouldn't do that? Let's look at the proof. So we had a good proof last time about the origin of the universe. There's a couple ways to do this. Premise 1, every law has a lawgiver. Premise 2, there is a moral law. Therefore, there is a moral lawgiver. That one's pretty easy. I get that. Every law has a lawgiver. Laws just don't spring into being. There is a moral law, therefore there is a moral lawgiver. That's from Turek and Geisler. Philosopher William Lane Craig has a bit more rigorous one that goes like this. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. That one may take some thinking. If God doesn't exist, then there are no objective moral values and duties. Because what do we ground them in? Objective moral values and duties don't just spring up out of nowhere. They've got to be grounded in something, and we've kind of gone through what we're going to ground them in. The individual, the elite of society, is it natural selection? Maybe it's, maybe we vote? No. They've got to be grounded in a supreme intelligent being. So if God does not exist, then these objective moral values and duties do not exist. We know that objective moral values and duties do exist. We can all condemn the Holocaust as something bad. What gives us the right to condemn that? Because there are objective moral values and duties. Therefore, God exists. Let's talk a little bit about subjective versus objective. Subjective is, my son Will loves mint chocolate chip ice cream. I like cookies and cream. And I really like the new one they came out with that blends the cookies and cream with the cookie dough. It's in the blue container. It's awesome. That's subjective. Well, my wife doesn't like that one. She likes different desserts. Subjective. I like chocolate. You like vanilla. Objective means it's true whether we like it or not. It has nothing to do with personal preference. If it's 78 degrees in this room, it is 78 degrees in this room, whether I think it's 65 or I think it's 100. That is an objective fact. That's scientific. Let's move into the moral realm of objectivity. Objective moral values and duties. What the Nazis did was wrong, even if they would have won World War II. Imagine if they'd have won World War II, and then they convinced all of us to believe like they did. And we all agreed with them. And every single person on the face of the earth agreed with what they did in the Holocaust. Would it still be wrong? Yes, it would. Because we subjectively can agree to whatever we want, but there is an objectivity in the moral realm outside of ourselves. It is outside of ourselves. It is objective. Has nothing to do with what we believe and whether we like it or not. So, if God does not exist, there are no objective moral values and duties. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. And I may bring this for us on a handout next time because these are fun to run through. The first one, if you're interested in this, comes from Turek and Geisler's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. The second, more complicated one comes from William Lane Craig. He has two great books. One is On Guard, the other is Reasonable Faith. First-rate, rigorous philosopher. Next week, we're going to talk about a debate that William Lane Craig has, and he's in debates all the time, with Sam Harris, who's extremely popular atheist, and he's only getting more and more popular. Some of you may have heard of Sam Harris. So Craig debates Harris. It's a really good battle of the heavyweights. Harris is a major, major heavyweight on the atheist side. We can't argue that he is a brilliant, brilliant person. And then Craig, first-rate philosopher, had a cool debate where they go through this. And we're going to get into it a little deeper next time, but they really got hung up. They grant premise 2. Objective morals, values, and duties exist. But premise 1, Harris really struggles with, what do I ground them in? I don't believe in God. I'm saying there's no God, but what do I ground them in? I think he ends up going with natural selection, but we'll get into it next time. Tough to ground them in natural selection. So there is our moral law. Let's look at 7 reasons why the moral law does exist. So we'll get in next time to premise. Let me go back so we can focus on where we are. We'll get in next time to more reasons on number 1, premise 1 of the second option. What do we ground them in? We'll talk about the debate. If God doesn't exist, maybe can they exist? Can we ground them in evolution? Can we ground them in, as we evolve from these little creatures, moral realms, moral norms kind of develop that we passed on? Maybe we can ground them in that. We'll get into that next time. Today, let's pick the low-hanging fruit and go easy and talk about why objective moral values and duties do exist. It's also premise 2 in the first one. There is a moral law. So, 7 reasons why there is a moral law. First, it is undeniable. The moral law is undeniable. Anyone who says there is no absolute truth, many will say that. Hey, there's no absolute truth. Ask them, is that absolutely true? Flip it, right? So they're arguing for something that there's no absolute truth. Well, is that absolutely true? Right? There is an absolute truth, and they're appealing to it when they're telling you that there is no absolute truth. There is a truth state. They're making a truth claim, and you cannot make a truth claim without truth existing. The moral law is undeniable. We ram our heads into it when we have that argument. Francis Schaeffer wrote a book And I think Greg Koukl wrote one by the same title. Schaeffer's in the 60s, Koukl is current day. Feet firmly planted in midair, where they just dissect and they kill moral relativism. It does not exist, or the fact that there is no absolute truth. Truth exists, and we can deny it all day long, but we're going to run into it anytime you and I have an argument. If truth doesn't exist, why are we even talking? Truth exists. Second, our reactions help us discover the moral law. So Norm Geisler tells a good story about a student in a philosophy class. And in it, they're talking about moral relativism and what's right and what's wrong and how do we know what's right and what's wrong. And the professor, being a typical college professor, is telling the students, there is no moral law. It's all relative. And let's write this paper on it. And so one particularly bright student wrote a wonderful paper on the moral law and how there is no such thing, and it's all relative. And he went and typed it up, got it all double-spaced, aligned perfectly, and he turned it in. And before turning it in, he went by and he bought a blue folder, and he puts it in this blue folder. Man, that paper's perfect, and it's well-written, and it's good. And he turns it in to the professor. When he gets it back, it's got an F on it. Why'd I get an F? Goes to the professor. He's angry. Why'd I get an F? And him and the professor are talking. The professor says, are you the guy who wrote the story, who wrote on there being no absolute truth? And he said, yes, I am. You taught us that. I believe it. And my paper was good. It was a great paper. He goes, okay. But it came in a blue folder, right? Yes. I don't like blue folders. You get an F. I don't like blue folders. I'm going to give you an F. I don't care how good it is. Good, bad, doesn't matter. There is no good. There is no bad. So the professor made his point to the student that if we're going to go down this route, we got to be willing to accept the consequences. Even making the argument against a moral law, he's relying on it and trying to get an A. A good paper deserves an A. But if it's all relative, if there's no good, no bad, no right, no wrong, well, you get an F because I don't like blue folders. I like chocolate, you like vanilla. We're just different like that. Second, people may claim that they're relativists. This is on our reactions, help us to discover it. But no one wants their spouse to behave like a relativist when it comes to being faithful. No one wants their spouse to behave like that. They want them to be moral absolute at that point. Or they may steal from others, but show outrage when they are stolen from. These reactions help us discover that there is a moral law out there. Otherwise, why would we react that way? Third, this is very important. Without the moral law, there would be no human rights. We had the Nuremberg laws, we had World War II, the Allies were victorious, and then they tried the Nazi folks as war criminals, the head Nazi guys, at the Nuremberg trial. So in the city of Nuremberg, very symbolic. Very symbolic that we did in Nuremberg. But there wouldn't have been those trials if there were no moral law. If there were no moral law, what the Nazis did would have been fine. But it's the moral law that helps us protect human rights. And this is somewhere where Christians, and speaking in Rockwall, Texas, I'm going to assume that the majority of you are probably conservatives, but this is somewhere where Christians and progressives can agree. Human rights is a big deal for those who are politically liberal or politically progressive. Human rights is a big deal for Christians, and it always has been. It may be a big deal for different reasons, but they both stem from there being a moral law and there being people made in the image of God. For us and for someone who maybe doesn't ground it in God, it's what's the right thing to do. Well, you can have a conversation with someone who believes in human rights because we do too. There would be none without the moral law. We go back to the Declaration of Independence. When we said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights and life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We hold these truths to be self-evident. If there were no moral law, I think the drafters would have had to write, we hold these opinions as our own. These are our opinions, and we're going to go to war and fight for these opinions that we hold. But they said no, they appealed to something outside themselves when King George III took it too far in the colonists' mind, and they decided to revolt because he crossed that line. He crossed the line of the moral law, and he violated their human rights, which gave us wonderful documents called the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And if you read these, they're obviously some of the most famous documents in the English language, and I'd argue the Bill of Rights is probably the most famous political document, maybe second to the Magna Carta in Great Britain. But if you read them, you see references to the Creator, to God. There's no question where our founders grounded morality. Morality wasn't natural selection, it wasn't the majority, it wasn't the elite, it wasn't the media of the time. They were grounded in God. They were grounded in God. Now, at that point, some of the philosophers of their day, such as John Locke, had already separated morality from God, and he was grounding them in natural law, capital N, capital L. It's natural law. It's natural law. Well, there still exists an objective morality in that philosopher's mind, but they were just grounded in something other than God. You can still work with that, but we ground them in God. Fourth, without the moral law, we could not know justice or injustice. One of the most important classes and one of the most meaningful ones that we will have is on the problem of evil. The number one objection to Christianity. It's the most emotional topic we get into, of how can God allow such evil things to happen? And it's the one that personally for me has been my biggest stumbling block in my faith from both an emotional perspective and a philosophical perspective. How do I defend, name it, how do I defend Hurricane Harvey? How do I defend the Thai boys stuck in the cave, say they all would have died? How do I defend these things and also uphold my image of a loving God? Atheists go there commonly. And in almost any debate you see between an atheist and a Christian, they're going to throw that out. That is usually a red herring. It's usually not on the problem of evil, but they're going to throw it out because it's emotional, it's catchy, it's good, and it's hard to formulate a response. However, as we'll talk about, one of the first responses to give is, if you are outraged by evil, Mr. Atheist, if you are outraged by evil, there has to be a standard by which you're judging good and evil. Thus, there's a moral law. If you can say something's evil and evil exists, then good must exist as well. Evil doesn't just exist in a vacuum. If evil exists, then good exists. So how do you answer for good, Mr. Atheist? Where does good come from? You use evil to attack my God, but in saying something is evil, there's got to be a standard, a moral standard out there. Where does your moral standard come from? That's a good response to the quote-unquote problem of evil when we think about evil and good. They've got to answer for the problem of evil as well, but also the problem of good. Norm Geisler he's one of the Christian debaters that you can go access his debates. He likes debating Jewish atheists because he'll immediately go to the Holocaust. He knows he can get common ground and that the Jewish atheist is not going to agree the Holocaust was a good thing. And so they immediately establish premise 2, that objective moral values and duties do exist. Or in the other formulation, there is a moral law. And so he immediately gets them on that they've got to admit that was wrong. And it's wrong for every society, no matter who would have won World War II, it's wrong. Thus, he loves debating Jewish atheists. That's our bell, but one more point. I want to make one more point. And we've talked with the 4th of July and talking about the Declaration of Independence, and with our Supreme Court nominees open, let's talk about an old Supreme Court justice named Oliver Wendell Holmes. He lived through the Civil War. He was one of the most important jurists in American history. He authored many, many opinions on our Supreme Court. Having been alive during the Civil War, he could not see any order to the universe. He could not see how God would allow that to happen, and he became an atheist. For 70 years, he worked to remove morality from the law. In his mind, we've got to get morality, we've got to get God out of our American law. This law needs to exist without any reference to God. And so, as our most important Supreme Court justice that we've had yet. He spent his whole career removing God from morality and removing morality from our law. Think about where that leaves us, though. That leaves us with the concept that the law is what we say it is. What other country that we led off with at the beginning of this lesson said the same thing? The law is what we say it is. In 1935, the Nazi Party said that. So when we remove God from our law, when we refuse to ground law in our legal system in God, we're going down a treacherous slope. We'll talk a little bit more about law and morality and the Supreme Court next time as we open. It's going to be a lesson I hope you enjoy. We're not getting political, but we're going to talk about where the Supreme Court's at and a little bit more about natural law and where we ground objective moral values and duties. Let me pray. Father, we thank you so much for your truth. We thank you for your word, and we thank you that it guides us and that we have no need to doubt what we believe and why we believe it. We thank you for sending us your light and your word, your Son, Jesus Christ. It is by him that everything is possible for us. We thank you so much for him. Father, we pray that you watch over us this week, that any conversations that we get into regarding these topics, that you bless them, that your Holy Spirit move within us, and that the Holy Spirit move within our words to move hearts and move minds, and that good can be established for your kingdom. We ask all this in the name of Christ. Amen. Moral Law Part 2 next time. Hope you're excited about it.